Sionigad, Jackie Wohatli Dawadoa. Hello, everyone. My name is Jackie Eagle, and I am a staff member with the Native American Support Center here at NSU. Today, I have the honor and privilege of welcoming you all to the 48th Annual Symposium on the American Indian. Today's session is titled The Strange Case of the Hipster Headdress, Reclaiming Indigenous Representations and Imagining Indigenous Futures, with which is a keynote presentation by Dr. Adrienne Keene of Brown University. As you are aware, this is one of many sessions, and we encourage all of you to check out our agenda and all of the sessions we have available. We are also recording all sessions, which will be made available in the coming weeks. Since this is a keynote, this session is also sponsored by the Oklahoma Humanities Council. And so now I would like to introduce our wonderful presenter, Dr. Adrienne Keene. Cherokee Nation is a Native scholar, writer, blogger, and activist, and is passionate about reframing how the world sees contemporary Native cultures. She is the creator and author of Native Appropriations, a blog discussing cultural appropriation and stereotypes of Native peoples in fashion, film, and music, and other forms of pop culture. If you are interested in seeing her full bio, please visit www.speakoutnow.org/speaker/Keene-Adrienne. And now I would like it to turn it over to Dr. Keene. Thank you.
Hello, Jackie. Thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen for y'all. Get my windows straight. Sionagad, Adrienne Keene Dakodoa. I am Adrienne Keene. I am a Cherokee citizen, but Providence, Rhode Island, Ginela, and Asenho, Dalonige de la Jutla Diega. I am currently based in Providence, Rhode Island, where I'm a faculty member at Uodige University, Brown University, and am originally from Southern California. And I am so grateful and humbled and excited to be talking with all of you today. I really wish I could have been there in person with everyone because I really miss Oklahoma. I really miss my family and my friends there, and it's been a while since I've been back. My grandma grew up outside of Wagner in the country, and unfortunately our allotment land are some of those ones that ended up under the lake. So I have been on kind of a lifelong journey of rebuilding those relationships and reconnecting with all of my family and community. So that makes me even more honored and excited to be here with all of you. So huge widow thank you to Sarah Barnett and everyone in the Center for Tribal Studies at NSU. There have been so many people scurrying around behind the scenes to make this possible. We've been planning for well over a year, like 2 years at this point. So thank you so much to everyone who made this possible. So my students at Brown, it's a big running joke that I always have like way too many things to try and fit into a certain amount of time. So we will see how much I get through today and how much we have a chance to talk about. So the game plan for today is I want to talk about Native representations kind of as a whole, reflecting back on some of the writing and work I've been doing for the past decade with my blog Native Appropriations and now with my podcast All My Relations, and thinking about the importance of the ways that Indigenous people are represented in society and how we can build and imagine different futures for our communities out of these representations. And so I usually start all of my talks with a land acknowledgement because that's kind of the thing that we do these days, which I've been very happy has moved into sort of commonplace practice. I'm guessing that the audience is going to be mostly Native folks today, so you know about this, but I think it's important. I wanted to share kind of what I do in predominantly non-Native spaces to challenge them to think a little bit further than just acknowledgement. So I offer the resources of native-land.ca and the telephone number that you can text with a zip code and a city or state, or city and state, to find out on the most general level, whose land you currently occupy. So for folks who don't know, that's an important place to start. Here in Providence, Rhode Island, where I'm based, we are at the confluence of several tribal nations' homelands. Where my house is right now, I am on Narragansett homelands. Brown University occupies both Narragansett for its main campus, and also we have Wampanoag lands as well. There are Nipmuc and other communities nearby. So those are the lands that I try to be in good relation with. And I come from Kumeyaay homelands in Southern California. But I like to join with some of my colleagues in what is currently known as Canada to try to move us beyond just acknowledgement to thinking more about action. So there's an Anishinaabe scholar named Hayden King who actually helped write his university's land acknowledgement and reflected on it a number of years later and is thinking about the ways that we can transform that practice. So he encourages universities and organizations and events to add this phrase after the acknowledgement, and this is what that compels me to do. So for predominantly Native organizations and Native folks, we are enacting these practices every single day, so it might not be necessary. But for non-Native institutions, that's really an important question. So to move it from just acknowledgement to this is what that compels me to do. So for me, it compels me every single day to center the experiences, voices, stories, struggles of Indigenous peoples on whoever's land I am on. And to put it even more succinctly, my colleague Kachabaldi, who is Hoopa, she said on Instagram one time, land acknowledgement is good, but land back is better. So the biggest question that I encourage folks to think about is how do we behave as good guests and good relatives to the land that we occupy, which I think is our ongoing lifelong challenge and struggle. So with that, I wanted to move into talking about these ideas of Native representations, of cultural appropriation, of stereotypes, misrepresentations. And to start that story, we have to go all the way back to the earliest days of what is currently known as the United States. Well, before it was even known as the United States. This is an etching of the Boston Tea Party, which is that, very well-known historic moment of resistance against the British Crown, where the colonists dressed up as quote unquote Mohawk Indians to throw tea into the harbor. And there are many Native scholars who have explored this phenomenon and this idea, most notably Phil Deloria, who's a Dakota scholar and wrote a book called Plain Indian. And he talks about that these early colonists and carrying through to today, they were searching for an identity that was distinctly American, that was not British, that was not these outside places, that was distinctly American and from the land that they were currently occupying. And so for them, that identity then became appropriating Indigenous identity, the people who had actual claims to the land, who had ties to that place. So this idea of plain Indian, synonymous with resistance or fighting back against the government or the powers that be by non-Native settlers, is something that started in the earliest days before the US was even a thing and has carried through to the present day. This comes from the January 6th insurrection at the Capitol. This was a very photo that was spread everywhere. Jake Angeli, who goes by the handle Q Shaman, and many people pointed to, he has some like sort of Norse mythology Viking tattoos, that this was a sort of Viking inspired thing. But I think if you look into the messages that he was sending, the fact that he was calling himself a shaman, the coyote skin that he is wearing on his head, this is very clearly an American Indian inspired getup. So the phenomenon that started back in those early days has continued till now and will continue into the future. So I think it's important to recognize that history and be able to unpack these representations a little bit more. So what most people in what is currently known as the United States, and you'll notice I keep using that mouthful because I really like it, because it sort of challenges our usual conventions around talking about the US. And that also comes from colleagues in what is currently known as Canada that I saw on Twitter one time. But I like saying what is currently known as the US because it acknowledges that this land was not always known as the US and gives us the opportunity to imagine that it might not always be known as the US. So while a mouthful, I like that it sort of calls into question this construct of what is currently known as the United States. So most Americans have no concept of Native peoples. And I know most Native folks, anytime you're interacting with non-Natives, you know that experience well. And so this is what happens when you Google image search Native American. And I am actually very happy that this screenshot has changed in the last 10 years dramatically from what it was when I started doing some of this writing and work. So you can see there's like Deb Holland on there. There's a few other contemporary representations, but largely most of the photos are set in the historic past. And this is even more clearly what happens when you Google image search American Indian. And again, a couple of contemporary representations. I see like Frank Wan on there. I see my colleagues at the Harvard University Native American program are on the bottom row. But the overwhelming sort of image in this is very much like from the previous one, set in the historic past, these sort of sepia-toned images, largely of men and largely of the sort of Plains Indian regalia. So Lakota, Dakota, sort of those communities that is drawn upon a lot for stereotypes in Hollywood, for stereotypes in advertising, mascots, etc. So these are the images and the messages that people are predominantly getting about Native peoples. So set in the historic past, the Plains Indian stereotypes, largely men, which sort of erases, of course, over half of the population of Indigenous peoples. So this is where most people are starting, is from a place that does not showcase the diversity of Indian country, that does not showcase the complexity of Native identity or where we come from or where we're going or any of those things. And so that is where I kind of started my work from. So the story of my blog, which I've now been writing for over a decade, which in internet years is like hundreds of years. It's more than a century, I would say, in internet years. My blog is called Native Appropriations. It looks at representations of Native peoples. And I started it as a first-year graduate student at the Harvard Graduate School of Education in Cambridge, Boston, Massachusetts. And so when I first moved to the East Coast, I was moving from California, where I was surrounded by a pretty diverse Native community on my campus where I graduated from. At least people there kind of knew that Natives existed. We had one of the largest powwows on the West Coast, largest student-run powwow in the world, which might cause some controversy for Oklahoma folks. But at least there was kind of an acknowledgement that Natives existed, that we looked different ways, that we came from different backgrounds, that sort of thing. When I moved to the East Coast, it was like experiencing invisibility on a level I had never imagined before. So I had classmates, I had faculty, I had folks in my life in Cambridge who told me to my face that they had never met a Native person before, who told me that they thought we were all dead, or those kind of stereotype interactions that I'd only ever heard of actually happened to me in real life. And at the same time, I was trying to do research with College Horizons, which is this amazing Native organization, trying to think about Native higher ed. And a lot of folks were confused about my work or why I would want to do that because it seemed so foreign to them. So I had increasing frustration. None of my faculty were Native, none of my syllabi had Native scholars on them. And one day in 2010, I was walking through Urban Outfitters, which was across the street from our campus. And it was sort of every stereotype of Native folks that you could imagine. It was like cultural appropriation central in Urban Outfitters. It was like this resurgence of tribal trends and fashion that had definitely cycled through in like the 1970s and that kind of thing, but we're back in full force in the 2010s. So it was like t-shirts with headdresses on them, like big dream catcher earrings, totem pole jewelry stands, all kinds of things, fake moccasins, whatever you can imagine. And so as I was walking through there, something kind of clicked, and I realized that my classmates and faculty and friends at Harvard, those were the only kind of representations of Native people they ever saw. They never saw real life, contemporary, complex Native representations. And so as someone who studied anthropology as an undergrad, was interested in museum representations, that kind of thing, I decided that this was a problem. And obviously I wasn't the first person to think about it, but I wanted to create a place where I could catalog these images, where I could point out how ubiquitous they are, how they're everywhere. So during that time, everyone had a blog. It was like a very personal blog revolution time. So I wasn't different in that. So I went to blogspot.com and I created this blog, and I called it Native Appropriations because I was gonna write about natives and cultural appropriation. So I like smushed it together. And this is what it used to look like. It was very dark and kind of like emo and sad, and reflected my mood at the time. But the very first post was about that trip to Urban Outfitters, because I went back armed with like a real digital camera, because in those days I had a Razor flip phone, so it did not have a fancy camera. And it's grown since then. So at the beginning, it was very much a lot of questions like, what does it mean that we're doing this? Like, what do you think? Because I didn't really have the words to talk about it. And through the years, as I learned more, as my voice on the subject got a little bit stronger, my confidence grew, the stories that I've been able to tell through the blog have changed as well. So it looks more like this now. It has said that it's under construction for 10 years, and it's just a good excuse for me to like not have coded it very well. So the blog continues, and now is really a place where we can just sort of talk about issues in Native communities, whether they're directly related to representations or not, because my argument is that everything we talk about is related to representations. So why do these images matter? I think is the biggest question of my work, and trying to articulate those arguments in different ways that people can understand. So on this little animated GIF here, you can see the rapid disappearance of Indigenous lands, or moving from Indigenous hands into settler colonizer hands in a relatively short period of time, if you look at the dates across the top. And so the way that the colonizers are able to justify this dramatic loss of land and accompanying dramatic loss of life is by painting the folks who already live there as inferior, as savage, as uncivilized, as unworthy of their land and their life. And these ideas about creating Native people as being inferior in every single way, as uncivilized, as savage, as like you see from that awful painting down at the bottom, that's where these ideas of being able to take from Indigenous cultures in the realms of cultural appropriation and misrepresentation comes from. So we have in colonization, it's really about these ideas of extraction. So settlers came to these lands, they tried to extract Indigenous peoples from those lands. As a Cherokee person, I definitely am acutely aware of that process of extraction, as are many of you. And then resources were and continue to be extracted from that land, often using enslaved labor as well. So people extracted from the land, resources extracted from the land. And now these processes of cultural appropriation are about cultural extraction. So now taking those pieces of culture in order to formulate that identity as American, as something that is distinctly can lay claim to these lands. If we think back to that image of the Boston Tea Party or of Q Shaman, continuing that process. So that it's really about these ideas of extraction. And if you will allow me to, I'll get a little bit professory on you for a couple of slides, just to talk about when we use this term cultural appropriation, what are we actually talking about? Because I think it's something that has become really abstracted and we use it in all kinds of different ways. So these are the ways that I think about it, coming from other scholars. So Lenore Keene Tobias, who is a First Nations writer from what is currently known as Canada, said this in 1990 at a conference about cultural appropriation in literature. And I always start with this one because it shows that this is a conversation that's been happening for a very long time in our communities, like well before the 90s. It's often framed as like something that happened in the last 10 years or this new idea. But the actual idea, the phrase cultural appropriation has been something Native communities have been talking about for a long time. So she says it's taking from a culture that is not one's own, intellectual property, cultural expressions and artifacts, history, and ways of knowledge. And I think that's a really good starting point, but it needs like a few more things to kind of refine it into something that is extremely useful. So this comes from a really cool guide put together by the Intellectual Property Issues and Cultural Heritage Project, the IPINCH project at Simon Fraser University. And they say that cultural appropriation describes a one-sided process where one entity benefits from another group's culture without permission and without giving something in return. So I think that definition is important because it points out how this is a one-sided process. This is taking. It's not an equal exchange. There's no reciprocity here. This is definitely taking without permission. And then finally, from good old Wikipedia, don't tell my students that I use this, but cultural appropriation is distinguished from equal cultural exchange due to the presence of a colonial element and an imbalance of power. So the power piece is the most important part to me when I think about it, in terms of this is a colonizer, someone in power taking from the colonized. There's not an equal exchange. It's not like we're all on the same playing field and all sharing culture equally. This is something where the dominant culture was forced upon all of us. The fact that we're speaking English today, that we're wearing Western clothing, all of these things are from outside. It wasn't like we were just adopting them because we thought they were cool. And we are not in a position to be able to directly challenge these misrepresentations of our culture. We can't change them without a lot of effort, a lot of work, and a lot of sort of subverting these power structures. So the power imbalance to me is the most important part. And I like this quote from Ijoma Oluo because the next question that always comes is like, okay, well, where's the line? Like, what can I do like up until the point where then it becomes appropriation? Like, where's the line? And so she says, cultural appropriation is the misuse of a group's art and culture by someone with the power to redefine that art, and in the process, divorce it from the people who originally created it. So when we think about Urban Outfitters and the example from my blog, when there's a totem pole jewelry stand, that completely divorces the practice of carving these poles like from the communities that they come from in the Pacific Northwest and up into Alaska. It redefines it into something that has a deep story and deep meaning, into this sort of trinket that you can hang your necklaces on. And so divorcing it from those people, divorcing it from those stories, divorcing it from that cultural practice, and in result, taking power away from those communities. And she continues to say, when well-meaning white people say, help me define cultural appropriation so I don't know what to do, what they're actually saying, even if they aren't aware, is help me understand how to continue in this system of privilege and oppression without feeling bad. Because the question is not, help me define it so I know not what to do. The question should be, how do I support communities? How do I do this right? Rather than focusing on that line of where it becomes cultural appropriation. And related to all of this is stereotyping. And quickly, the problem with stereotyping is that it shrinks the diversity of Indian country down to a set of one-sided stereotypes. So we know now there's 575 federally recognized tribes, hundreds more state recognized, non-recognized tribes, and each of them has their own language, their own cultural and spiritual practices, government, history, etc. And that does not get represented in those Hollywood Indian sort of stereotypes. Sets us in the historic past, as you remember from the Google slide, mostly those sepia-toned Edward Curtis photographs, or as extinct. And that really erases our contemporary existence, erases all of the joys and wins and amazing work that's happening, and also the struggles and challenges and ongoing problems that we are working towards fixing. And lastly, these images then become real Indians in people's minds. And I think that's a lot of what I've always struggled with in my life, is that the images I saw never represented my own family or the people I knew. They always felt very different and very distant from what I knew. So we know that Native identity is super complex. It has to do with tribal citizenship and tribes that still use the problematic idea of blood quantum. And all of this is affected by colonization. And these aren't things that come from within our communities. And these images don't help that process of showing the vast diversity, because our identity is not just a racialized identity. It's one that is about being connected to a sovereign nation, and that's a political identity. And that side of our identity does not ever get represented in these stereotypes. So the other reason why this matters is that it has actual impacts on the self-esteem and self-worth of Native youth. And there's an amazing, groundbreaking study by Dr. Stephanie Freiberg, who is from Tulalip in Washington. And so she did kind of the first quantitative study to psychological study to look at the impacts of these images. So her study showed a series of images to both Native youth and white youth, and then had them do measures of self-esteem. So this is like a total quick version of her results, but you can see here on the top of the slide are American Indian students, on the bottom of the slide are white students. And for all the way on the right is the control, so they weren't shown any sort of these Native images, just shown random images. And you can see that Native youth and white youth, the slide got a little squished on the bottom, I was trying to fit it all in, but they actually had very similar starting points for their self-esteem. And I think there's such a stereotype that Native youth have really low self-esteem, but when they're shown just sort of benign and general images, Native youth in this study had very similar self-esteem to white youth. But then when they were read a list of negative stereotypes of Native people or shown Chief Wahoo or Disney's Pocahontas, you can see from that dotted line down, their self-esteem dropped and dropped in a statistically significant way. So this wasn't something that was just like a fluke. So these images are having real impacts on Native youth self-esteem. And the interesting thing of that top part is that Pocahontas is often considered a sort of good representation in that she's not a wild-eyed caricature like Chief Wahoo. She like is a Disney princess, but even that limited the self-esteem of Native youth. But to me, what's even more disturbing is the bottom of the slide, where you can see that for each of those situations, the self-esteem of the white students went up. So they felt better about themselves at the subjugation and stereotyping of Native people. So in every situation, their self-esteem went statistically significantly up. And so that to me points to the fact that this isn't just about these images hurt Native youth. They're really reifying white supremacy. They're telling these white youth that they should feel better about themselves, that they are not Native. And that to me is really scary and even bigger of a problem. But it also goes to show why white folks are often hesitant to change these images, because they literally make them feel better about themselves, even if it's on a psychological level that they're not aware of. And so that kind of points to how difficult these images are to change. But the bottom line that I tell everyone, I use this tweet from 2015 all the time, which I love. And it just says, how to respectfully partake in someone else's culture. Be invited, follow your host's lead, and respect their boundaries. To me, that is not that difficult and really covers pretty much every situation you can think of. So be invited, follow your host's lead, and respect their boundaries. So going back to my blog, I have, as I said, been writing it for 10 years. There are like 350 posts on there. Some of them I am really embarrassed by, and please don't go digging into the earliest days of the blog. Other ones I am proud of, and they continue to be shared and be useful for people, which I am grateful for. But as you can see from the slide, I've covered everything from Halloween costumes to offensive parties, and when the governor of Oklahoma's daughter wore a headdress for a photo shoot, and starter witch kit at Sephora, hipster headdresses, Johnny Depp as Tonto, the American Wizarding School, all kinds of things. And so for 10 years, I've been really about trying to react and respond to the ways that the dominant culture has misused Native images, Native cultural practices, cultural appropriation, etc. And so it's really been this act of reacting, responding, trying to create resources for people to understand why this is so wrong. And that was, I feel like, folks can tell me after, I feel like that was necessary for that kind of period of time where a lot of folks didn't have this language to talk about cultural appropriation, to talk about why, where the conversations were really difficult and hard. So it might be easier to send someone a blog post rather than having that conversation in person. But the amazing thing that we have seen just even in the last year or so is that things are really changing. So we are in this moment where things are not excellent in terms of racial justice. They, I would argue, have never been excellent, but there have been some really visible moments, some catalysts. If we think about right now, we're seeing the Derek Chauvin trial in Minneapolis over the murder of George Floyd, and the Black Lives Matter movements and uprisings that have come about because of these horrific killings of Black folks at the hands of police and in other sort of vigilante situations has really been a catalyst for a lot of forward motion around issues of racial justice. So and right now we're also seeing like this is continuing. It's not like something happened and it's not continuing now. We have these increasing rates of hate crimes and violence against the Asian American and Pacific Islander community. Just this week, Daunte Wright was murdered by a police officer in Minnesota. So this is continuing, but the momentum behind it has been really powerful and really strong around reckoning for racial justice. So Native folks have been fighting misrepresentations for a very long time, back into the 60s and beyond, around mascots, around misrepresentations in museums, all of these things. So I'm not arguing that this is new. It's definitely something that the momentum and the strength has been building for decades and decades. And it got us really to this precipice in this moment where now Black Lives Matter and the movements and uprisings for racial justice have pushed us over the edge. And there's been a really rapid change in a lot of areas that I honestly never thought we would see changes in my lifetime. So we have the Washington football team. And this is another one where the work of Native activists has been working around this for decades and decades, and lawsuits and Supreme Court cases. And it really finally took this moment for it just to become so apparent that this was not something that could continue into the future. So again, all of that momentum now carried over into finally the change of the name, thank goodness. We also saw a rapid fall, a literal fall of all of these statues of Columbus and of other really racist and problematic figures throughout the United States. I love the little video of the one being pulled down. This is in Minneapolis. So we're seeing a reckoning around these narratives that we've been telling of the origins of what is currently known as the US. So who are we celebrating? Who are our heroes? The Land O'Lakes butter logo, which I know was kind of the bane of my existence. I feel like that little woman haunted me for a long time whenever I go in the grocery store. They, without a lot of ceremony, just sort of removed the logo and are now focusing on the farmers that make the milk that they make their products out of. Though a Native TikToker pointed out, which I really loved, of course, they removed the native but kept the land. Which is very clear, but at least the stereotype is gone. The ski resort that has a name that I don't even like to say because I find it pretty offensive, they decided to change their name. And this was huge because they've hosted the Olympics, they've done a lot of things. So the fact that they decided not only to change it, but talked about why is really important. So they talked about who they collaborated with, who they talked to, and that it is a racist and sexist slur. So they're going to change it. So then Spirit Halloween store unceremoniously removed all of the Indian costumes from their online store this year. So you can't buy an Indian costume online. Some people sent me images that they are still in the stores, but the company said that those are back stock and they are not remaking any of these costumes. So again, not something I ever thought I would see. So that brings us to this kind of new chapter. So the representations are falling really quickly. The conversations seem to be moving forward in leaps and bounds around the importance of representation for marginalized communities. So where do we go from here? And it's exciting to think that maybe for the rest of my career, I won't have to spend tearing down these misrepresentations and instead can spend time creating our own stories, uplifting the amazing things that are happening in our communities. And that's kind of the moment that I feel that we are in now. So in the past few years, I've started a podcast with my colleague and friend Matika Wilbur, who's a Swinomish and Tulalip photographer. And our podcast is called All My Relations. And we started it to basically think about ideas of Indigenous relationships, because for us, that's what grounds us as Indigenous people. It's those ties to land and community and relatives, both human and non-human, and all of those pieces stretch into everything that we think about as Indigenous people. And so through this platform, we've been able to talk to the most incredible folks about their stories, about their work, about the things they think about, and in the process, speak to Native people, a Native audience, about things that we care about, bringing these issues out into the open, having more complex and deeper conversations, but also talk to a non-Native audience and show them in a lot of ways that we are not those stereotypes, that we have all of these complex identities and challenges and joys and amazing stories about having to live under colonization, about fighting colonization, about dreaming beyond colonization. And so changing the narrative from just reacting to these negative moments has been really powerful for me to think about, okay, so we've torn down these representations. So now what do we do? How do we replace them? What are the narratives that we want people to replace them with? And the podcast has been a place for that. So I'm taking a break for season 3 because I am writing a book that I really need to get done. But the podcast continues. My friend and colleague Desi Small Rodriguez has stepped in for co-hosting duties for season 3. So the episodes continue to come out and are have just been really powerful spaces to have some of these conversations. And then I have a couple of examples of other things that I'm really excited about in the realms of TV and literature and fashion, because those are things that I think about a lot. But on the screen here are just some examples of the ways that Native folks have been claiming space in the mainstream sort of TV realm. So Rutherford Falls is a show that's coming out very soon that stars Native people, that has a Native showrunner, Sierra Ornelas, who's Navajo, that has, I think, like 5 or 8 Native writers on the show, just really thoughtful in its production, contemporary Native people, also has Ed Helms, who is from The Office, like him. So that's going to be really cool. It's on the Peacock Network, which is the streaming platform for, what is that, ABC, NBC? The Peacock one. Anyway, Molly of Denali is this amazing children's show on PBS. If you have little ones in your life, or even if you don't, I love this show. It stars an Alaska Native girl voiced by a Native young woman. It has a Native creative producer, Princess Johnson. They incorporate Native cultural practices into the show in like a really beautiful way. I teach it in my classes, so college students love it as well as preschoolers. Just amazing. Sterling Harjo and Taika Waititi are working on Reservation Dogs for FX. Bird, Running Water, and Ava DuVernay have a show that's going to be a pilot on NBC called Sovereign, which is like a Native family drama. And then, of course, I have to give a shout out to OCO TV because I think the sort of documentary style, groundbreaking work of showing real contemporary Cherokee people and the things that folks are doing in community has been really important in creating these counter narratives, in creating the new stories. And then in the realm of fashion, we have examples like Indigenous Fashion Week Toronto, which I am so excited it's going to be back in person in 2022. But this is just one example of the ways that Native folks are reclaiming that fashion space, doing really cool kind of futurist imaginings. And then Native literature is just exploding right now. I think there is a recognition that it's powerful to let Native people tell their own stories, and that these are stories the public wants to hear and needs to hear. So in the realm of the top collage is like adult books, and the bottom collage is children's books. And recently We Are Water Protectors, which has a Native illustrator and author, won the Caldecott Medal, which is the biggest award in children's literature for illustrated books. And it's just an absolutely gorgeous book. So a lot of incredible work going on there. And y'all get the first peek. I have not shared this publicly at all. This is the cover of my new book that is coming out in October. It's called Notable Native People, 50 Indigenous Leaders, Dreamers, and Changemakers from Past and Present. And it's 50 short biographies of incredible Native people, along with little spreads around settler colonialism and whose land are you on, and representations matter, and those kinds of things. So my goal with this book was to continue this idea of what are the images we want people to replace these negative ones with? How do we celebrate and uplift the amazing things that are going on in Indigenous communities? And you'll see on there, Sequoia made the cover. So Cherokee pride right there. My first version of the list of the 50 people had 5 Cherokees, and they told me that that was a little over-representation. So we had 2. We have Sequoia and Wilma Mankiller, and then I have a list of more people in the back. And Mary Golda Ross, who was a Cherokee engineer at Lockheed, she made it into that. So I got 3, which I think is pretty good. But I want to end with this idea of Indigenous futurism. So we, for so long, have been thinking about this narrative of we are still here. And we have been having to show people that we have survived and we are still here. We never left. These are our lands. But to me, what's exciting about Indigenous futurisms is that it moves the narrative to we will always be here. So there are Cherokee people in the future, there are Native people in the future, and what does that future look like? What do Indigenous people look like? What do our relationships to lands look like? What does our world look like beyond settler colonialism? And so we've seen through all of these pieces that representations matter so much in being able to see futures for ourselves. So for those young people who saw the mascot images, they were limited in their abilities to see themselves in possibilities, in possible selves. And so you cannot be what you can't be what you can't see is kind of the rallying cry of a lot of these representations movements. But I think it's really true that we are only limited by our ability to imagine a future beyond colonization. So to me, Indigenous futurisms are important because we've already survived the apocalypse. Our worlds as we knew it completely ended with settler colonialism. So settler colonialism was that apocalypse. And futurisms give us the power to imagine beyond settler colonialism. So this is currently known as the United States, but what is it known as 1,000 years in the future, 200 years in the future? And our cultures have always transformed and shifted in reaction to the world around us. Where there's not like some point in history where our cultures were pure and we've just sort of been diluted since then. Our cultures have always adapted and always brought in new technology. Cherokee people have always been big on technology. I think we had like the first phone west of the Mississippi or something like that. So imagining a future where indigeneity is present but it transformed is important for us to be thinking about how do we take all of these modern technologies and adapt them and make them into things that are going to serve the needs of our communities. So that shift from we are still here to we will always be here. And then of course, because representations matter. So it's important to imagine an otherwise, to think about something beyond. And Adrienne Marie Brown, who is a Black queer science fiction writer, also organizer, just incredible. She has a quote where she says, "Science fiction is simply a way to practice the future together." I suspect that's what many of you are up to, practicing futures together, practicing justice together, living into new stories. It is our right and responsibility to create a new world. And on that note, the last thing I want to end with is going back rather to the future, going back to the origins and thinking about where we come from. And so in our Cherokee origin story, it's Dayunisi, the water bug, who is the one that brings the earth from the bottom of the water up to put on turtles' back to become the lands that we now live on. And for our Anishinaabe relatives, they have a similar story, but muskrat is their water bug who brings up the mud. And so Anishinaabe artist named Chief Ladybird posted this on her Instagram, and I keep thinking about it and the power of stories and how our creation story can also be the creation of our future story. So she said that she was thinking about muskrat in relation to why we are building the foundations for a future that enables our children and the land to thrive. Every time we learn a word from our language, that's our little muskrat paw putting another chunk of mud on our turtle's back. Every time we unlearn toxic behavior, that's another chunk of mud on the turtle's back. Every time we resolve our trauma, resist colonial effery, and fight against systemic and environmental racism, that's another chunk of mud on turtle's back. We are the muskrat. How are you adding mud to the turtle's back? So in thinking about creating these futures that we want to live in together, creating these stories that are ours, that come from our communities, I hope that we can end with this thought of how are we adding mud to the turtle's back? What are the stories that we want to tell? What are the things that we want our children and our grandchildren and the future generations to know about who we are as Indigenous people? And that to me is why representations matter. It's creating these stories and these futures for us to grow into, to live into. So with that, Wado, thank you. Here are the ways you can keep in touch. I am taking an Instagram break right now, but we'll be back soon to talk more about notable Native people. And yeah, so I think we have time for a few questions, and thanks for your patience with the technology at the beginning too. And thank you to everyone for making this happen. So Wado.
Thank you so much, Dr. Keene, for coming today. I think in this time where Native issues are really coming to light and in the forefront and in places we haven't really seen them, the work you're doing is very important. And it's something that needs to be continued by not only you, but like those who follow you and the generations after. So I guess I'll open up if there's anyone in the audience who has any questions for Dr. Keene. Right. So I had a question listening to your talk. How can allies to Native communities contribute and participate in cultural reappropriation in a meaningful way? Do you have any advice for them on like how they can go about really helping move these issues forward?
Yeah, that's a great question, because none of those examples that I talked about where things have been happening in mainstream spaces, like with TV and literature and et cetera, none of those could happen without the strong support from non-Native allies in those spaces. And I even like the word like accomplice or co-conspirator a little more than ally, because it again moves it to that sort of like action-oriented idea. So it takes non-Native folks in these spaces leveraging their power and making space for Native people. And then also supporting Native creators and Native spaces that are outside of the mainstream. So those were like examples of things that are happening in the more public facing mainstream spaces, but Native folks are creating content all over the place that is there for people to see and to watch and to read and to purchase in the case of Native fashion. So I think it's just about getting behind Native people, supporting them in what they want to do, not trying to enforce your beliefs or narratives on top of it, just being excited to engage and learn and support whatever it is Indigenous folks want to do. So leveraging that power and privilege to create positive change.
Thank you very much for that. And thank you so much for being here. We really enjoyed your presentation. So much good information shared. So thank you very much for coming today.
Thank you. Wado.